"Fear me, human, the alien queen." Roared, he just smiled, after my ex-wife, you're adorable, the tractor beam hit my ship before I even finished my first cup of coffee. I remember the exact moment. I had the mug halfway to my mouth, and then the entire rig shuddered like something had grabbed it by the throat. Hot coffee went sideways across the control panel. I swore, grabbed a rag and checked the radar with one hand while cleaning up the mess with the other. That is the kind of man I am. That has always been the kind of man I am. Practical, unhurried, deeply underpaid. The radar told me everything I did not want to know. A Wraith warship carrier class hull markings indicating the Imperial fleet had pulled up off my port side at a distance of about 800 m. It was enormous. It was crimson and black, all sharp angles and protruding gun arrays, and it moved through space the way a predator moves through tall grass, quiet, patient, already certain of the outcome. I set down my mug. My name is Marcus Vell. I am 39 years old. I haul salvage for a living on a mid-range freight rig called the Colo Bird, which is a stupid name that came with the ship and which I never got around to changing. I operate mostly in the outer lanes of the galactic compact trade routes, picking up derelict cargo containers and broken down automated haulers and selling the parts to repair stations. It is not glamorous work. It does not pay well, but it is quiet, and after the last 3 years of my life, quiet is the thing I value most. Before the salvage work, I had a different life. I had a house on Titan Station, a joint account with a woman named Claire, 2 matching coffee mugs that I bought at a market on Europa, and a future I thought I understood. Then Claire and I got divorced, and the house went to her. The account was frozen pending settlement, and the mugs I kept because they were the only thing left in the apartment when the movers came, and I simply forgot to pack them into a box. The divorce took 14 months to finalize. The proceedings involved 3 attorneys, 1 mediator who charged by the minute, a financial auditor named Gerald who spoke entirely in a flat monotone and seemed to take personal pleasure in telling me what I could no longer afford, and a judge who I am convinced had made her decision before I even sat down. I lost more in that courtroom than I had ever accumulated in the decade before it. I walked out of the final hearing with a settlement agreement, a medium-sized debt, and a peculiar kind of calm that I later came to understand was not peace but exhaustion that had gone so deep that it had become permanent. I got the Colo Bird 6 months after that. I named it stupidly, or rather I did not rename it at all, and I flew it out to the outer lanes, and I started picking up broken things for money. It felt appropriate. The point is, when the Vreth warship locked its tractor beam onto my rig that Tuesday morning, I was already a man who had survived the thing that was supposed to destroy him. I did not know that yet, not in any way I could articulate, but somewhere in the back of my mind, without me noticing, the calibration had already shifted. I opened the comm channel. Standard protocol when boarded in compact space is to identify yourself and state your cargo. I did both. I told them my name, my registration number, my salvage license code, and the fact that I was carrying 3 containers of strip drive components and 1 container of miscellaneous hull plating from a derelict I had pulled 2 days earlier near the Cassock's belt. All legal, documented, all boring. There was a long Pause on the other end, then a voice came through. It was translated through my ship's language processor, which rendered Vreth into a flat, slightly metallic version of standard compact trade language. The voice said, "You are carrying Imperial property. You will submit to boarding and surrender the cargo immediately. Resistance will result in the immediate termination of your vessel." I looked at my 3 cargo containers on the scanner, drive components, hull plating, nothing that belonged to an interstellar empire. I said. The voice said, "I think there's been a mistake." The voice said, "There has been no mistake." The tractor beam tightened. I felt the whole ship groan. I thought about Claire's attorney, the one with the red tie who had walked into the mediation room already knowing exactly how this was going to end and had not bothered to hide it. He had looked at me the same way this warship was looking at my little salvage rig right now, like the outcome was already written and my job was simply to catch up with it. I finished my coffee. It had gone cold. 6 soldiers came aboard through the docking clamp. They attached to my starboard hatch. They were Vreth, which meant they were tall. They moved like they had too many joints in all the wrong places, and their armor was the same crimson black as the warship outside. They had weapons drawn before the hatch had fully opened. I was standing in my own corridor with my hands visible, which is the sensible thing to do, and I watched all 6 of them fill the narrow space and make it feel very small. Their squad leader looked at me with the compound eyes that the Vreth have, which do not blink and do not move, and somehow managed to convey contempt anyway. He said something in Vreth that my earpiece translated as, "You are smaller than expected." I said, "I get that a lot." They took me without any drama. I did not resist. I had nowhere to run, and besides, I have found that drama rarely improves a situation. They walked me back through the docking clamp and into the warship, and I had just enough time to notice that the inside of a Vreth Imperial carriers smelled like something between machine oil and something organic that I could not quite name, and that every surface was hard and angular and covered in faintly glowing script that I could not read. They put me in a holding room. It was clean. It had a bench. I sat down. I was held there for what my watch told me 4 hours. Nobody came. There was no water. I sat on the bench and thought about my cargo and about what Imperial property could possibly mean, and about whether Gerald, the financial auditor, had somehow managed to reach across the galaxy and ruin my life one more time. I would not have put it past him. When the soldiers finally came back, there were 8 of them this time. The squad leader told me through his earpiece translator that I was being taken before the Queen. I said, "Which Queen?" He said, "There is only one." I thought about that for a moment. Queen Zarvoth. I had heard the name, of course. Everyone in the outer lanes had heard the name. She was the ruler of the Vreth Imperium, which controlled 11-star systems and had not lost a military engagement in over 200 years. She was described in compact intelligence briefings, at least the ones that filtered down to freight haulers, as ruthless, brilliant, and utterly without mercy. She had personally directed the campaign that ended the Halcyon Republic, which had been a civilization of roughly 40 billion people. She had done it in 6 months. The soldiers walked me through corridors that were long and high-ceilinged and lined with things I could only assume were trophies because they were large and damaged and mounted on the walls with the deliberate care. That suggested, as did they were meant to be looked at, ship parts banners from other cultures, a few things I did not recognize and did not ask about. At the end of the longest corridor was a door that was very large and very heavy and opened inward with a sound like the settling of a mountain. Beyond it was a room that was clearly built to make people feel small. It succeeded. Ceiling was easily 40 ft up. The floor was dark stone or something that looked like dark stone. At the far end on a raised platform was a throne, and on the throne sat the most powerful being in 6 star systems. I walked toward her across that floor, and I thought clearly and without panic. She reminds me of Claire's attorney, not in appearance, in posture, and the absolute certainty that she already knew how this was going to end. I had been wrong about the attorney. I had lost, yes, but I had walked out breathing. I kept walking. The queen looked down at me with eyes that caught the light like cut glass. She was enormous and armored and entirely still, and the court around her was silent in the way that rooms go silent when something dangerous is about to happen. Her bioluminescent markings pulsed once slowly in a pattern her court clearly recognized, because several of them took a small step backward. I stopped at what felt like the appropriate distance and waited. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she leaned forward just slightly and spoke. The translator rendered her words in a clean, precise voice that somehow stood or carried the weight of someone who had never once been told no. You have stolen from the Vreth Imperium, she said. The penalty is death. Do you understand this? I looked at her. I thought about the morning of the final hearing. I thought about Gerald's monotone. I thought about the judge's face before I had even spoken, and I thought she's going to be fair about it. At least, whatever happens, she believes she has a reason. That is more than the mediation room gave me. I didn't know it was there, I said. Whatever it is, I pulled a derelict. The cargo was on the manifest as salvage components. I didn't plant it, and I didn't know. She looked at me the way that people look at things they are about to remove from their path. I held her gaze. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat steady, not as fast as it probably should have been. That calm that is too deep to be peace. I was already in the worst place I had ever stood, and I was still standing. The throne room had perfect acoustics. Every sound carried. I could hear the faint hum of the ship's engines. Somewhere deep below the floor, a low, constant vibration that I felt more in my chest than heard with my ears. I could hear the breathing of the soldiers standing behind me. I could hear my own boots on the dark stone floor as I shifted my weight slightly, because I had been standing for a long time now, and my left knee aches in cold rooms, and that warship was very cold. Queen Zareth had not moved. She sat with the stillness of something that had never once felt the need to rush, and she watched me with those glass-cut eyes, and her court watched her, and nobody in that enormous room said anything. Then she rose from the throne. She was taller standing than I had estimated from a distance, 8 ft easily. Maybe a fraction more. Her armor was layered chitin over what I assumed was a harder underlayer, shaped and fitted the way armor is when it has been made specifically for the person wearing it, rather than pulled off a rack. Her bioluminescent markings ran from her collar down her forearms in lines that were currently a deep, slow amber. I had no idea what amber meant in Vreth body. Language, but the court was very still. So I assumed it was not good. She descended the platform steps with a measured pace, each footfall deliberate. And she crossed the floor toward me, until she stopped at a distance that was close enough to be a statement. She looked down at me, I looked up at her. This was objectively an absurd situation for a divorced salvage hauler from Titan Station to find himself in, and some part of me recognized that and found it faintly funny in a way I did not let reach my face. She said in that precise translated voice, "You are either very brave or very foolish. Your species tends toward both," I said. I've been told it's hard to tell the difference. Something moved through her. Court, not quite a sound, more like a collective intake of breath held just a beat too long. She studied me, her head tilted the way that a bird's head tilts. Sharp and sudden, a single degree off center. "You were told you face death," she said. "You are standing here as though we are having a conversation about whether." I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Claire, not about her face, not about the good years, not about any of the things that used to come back to me at bad hours. I thought about the day of the final hearing, the way I had sat in the parking structure of the arbitration building for 40 minutes after it was over, not crying, not angry, just sitting in the car with the engine off and both hands on the wheel, feeling the particular weight of a life that had just been formally, legally, permanently altered. I had driven home after that. I had made dinner. It was pasta because pasta was cheap and easy, and I was very tired. I had watched something forgettable on the screen. I had slept not well, but enough. The next morning I got up. That was the whole of it, really. That was the thing I had learned without knowing. I was learning it, that the worst thing can happen and the sun still comes up, and your body is still hungry, and the day still needs to be moved through, and so you move through it, not because you're brave, not because you've made peace with anything, just because the alternative is worse and you've already lost enough. I looked up at the Queen, and I said, "I've had a rough few years." The amber in her markings pulsed. Once she said, "Tell me." I blinked. "I'm sorry, tell me about these rough years." Her translated voice carried no mockery. She sounded, if anything, curious in the way that a scientist sounds curious when a result comes back unexpected. "You are standing in my throne room. You have been informed of your death sentence. You are looking at me as though I am a minor inconvenience. I want to understand why." I thought about it. I said, "Have you ever been married?" That landed differently than I expected. The court moved, real movement. This time the shuffle of weight shifting. A few exchanged glances between the soldiers nearest the platform. The Queen's amber markings flickered. She said, "Vreth do not pair bond." I said, "Right, so imagine entering into a legal agreement with another person that is supposed to be permanent. You combine everything, your finances, your living space, your plans for the future. You build something together, or you try to, and then it ends. Not because of anything violent, just because the thing stops working and the two of you can't agree on how to fix it. And eventually someone files paperwork, and the whole structure is dismantled, piece by piece, in a room with lawyers, while a man named Gerald tells you what you're going to lose." She was quiet for a moment. "Gerald," she repeated. "Financial auditor," I said. He had a voice like a machine that was running low on power. He read out numbers for 6 Ours and this experience, she said, slowly is worse than what you are currently facing. I considered that. Seriously, I looked at her. I looked at the court. I looked at the guards with their weapons. I looked at the trophies on the walls. Your Majesty, I said, with all due respect, you're the most frightening thing I've encountered in about 4 years. And that's including the Halcyon documentary I watched last cycle. She stared at me. But you're going to be fair about it, I said. You think I stole something? You have a law. You're applying the law. I can work with that. The mediation room was not fair. Gerald was not fair. The judge had decided. Before I sat down, I paused. You at least look me in the eye first. The silence that followed was the longest I had experienced since the parking structure after the final hearing. Then Queen Zareth, conqueror of the 9 moons, ender of the Halcyon Republic, ruler of 11 star systems, leaned forward toward me until her face was perhaps 18 inches from mine, and her bioluminescent markings blazed into a pattern I had no name for, and she roared. The sound filled the entire throne room. It was not a word at first. It was pure sound, the kind that moves through your chest and vibrates in the fillings of your teeth. The court snapped to rigid attention. The soldiers behind me stepped back. The temperature of the room seemed to drop 2 degrees. It was, by any objective standard, one of the most physically impressive displays of dominance I had ever witnessed. Then the word came through my earpiece, translated precisely and without inflection. Fear me, human. I looked at her. I thought of Claire's face at the mediation table, that specific expression she had when she already knew she had won and was waiting for me to figure it out. The way the room had felt, the way Gerald had looked at his numbers, the way the judge's pen had moved before I had spoken a single word. This was terrifying. I will not pretend it was not. My hands were not shaking only because I had spent 3 years learning how to hold things steady after they were already broken. But it was not new. The shape of it was not new. The certainty on the other side the closed door, the already written outcome. I had been here before. The room was different. The stakes were different. The creature in front of me was different. The feeling was not. I looked at the queen, who was still leaning toward me with her markings blazing, and something that was not bravery and was not stupidity moved through me, and I smiled, a real one, not performed, not defiant, just the smile of a man who has been to the bottom already and knows, with the certainty of lived experience, that it does not have to kill you. After my ex-wife, I said, "You're adorable." I have thought about that moment many times since. I have thought about it from the perspective of someone who survived it, which is the only perspective I have. I know what I felt. I know that I meant it not as an insult, but as something much stranger and harder to explain. Kind of genuine affection for the simplicity of a danger that was only mortal. Claire's attorney had threatened things that could not be rebuilt. This creature in front of me could only take my life. What I did not know in that moment was what the word adorable translated to in Vreth. I found out later that the closest equivalent was something between magnificent and terrifying, used by Vreth to describe natural forces that are too large to be stopped but too beautiful to look away from. In the throne room nobody moved. The queen straightened, her markings shifted slowly from blazing white to a color I Had not seen yet a deep complex, blue-green that rippled like water, her head tilted again, that sharp bird. Degree. She looked at me the way imagine a scientist looks when the unexpected result happens a second time in a row and she starts to think it might not be an accident. What is she? Said very quietly as an ex-wife, and that was how I ended up staying, not in a cell, not quite in a guest room. Something in between, near the scholars' quarters that had a bunk heating unit and a small window that looked out on the stars. The death sentence was not lifted, it was simply, as the court translator explained to me, postponed pending further inquiry. I had been given a reprieve, not because they thought I was innocent, but because the Queen was curious. In 14 years of Vreth military history, I was told by the young court researcher named Dell, who became my unofficial handler, no human had ever stood in the throne room and responded to the Queen's display with something the translator could only render as a compliment and a laugh. Dell was young by Vreth standards, which meant he was probably 70 years old and had only 3 of the 4 antenna-like sensory organs that older Vreth developed. He was assigned to me, I assumed, because nobody more senior wanted the job. He spoke trade language well, almost without the metallic flatness of the standard translator, and he looked at me with a combination of professional fascination and personal wariness that I found completely reasonable. She wants to know everything about your ex-wife, he told me on the first morning, delivering something that was food in the way that engine components are technically fuel, and also about the mediation room, and about Gerald. I ate the food. It tasted like nothing particular, but it was warm. Gerald is not that interesting. She has read the phrase financial auditor 7 times in the report and says she does not understand what power a person with numbers has over person with assets. I thought about that. Tell her it's complicated, she says. Everything humans say is complicated. That's fair, I said, and outside the small window the stars moved past. The same stars I had been driving my salvage rig through for 3 years, alone and quiet, and recovering from a thing I had not yet finished recovering from. I was aboard an alien warship under a suspended death sentence, eating food that had no flavor. A queen who controlled 11 star systems had asked me to explain my divorce. I thought this is still less strange than the day Gerald presented the asset report. I finished eating. I told Dell I was ready to talk. Nobody warned me about the scholars. There were 9 of them. They came into the room Dell had been using for our conversations, which was a kind of narrow conference space off the main research corridor, and they arranged themselves along one side of the low table in a row with their documentation devices out and their sensory organs pointed at me like antennae tracking a signal. They varied in age, which for Vreth meant they varied in how many of those antenna-like organs they had fully developed and how much their armor-like exoskeleton had hardened and deepened in color over time. The oldest one in the room was nearly as tall as the Queen and moved with the slow deliberateness of something that had been doing things carefully for a very long time. Her name, Dell told me, was Researcher Vreth Karen, and she was the senior xenobiologist of the Imperial Fleet. She had spent 60 years studying species the Imperium had encountered. She looked at me with the expression of someone who had just been handed a problem that did not fit any of the existing categories. She said through the room's translator, "We will begin with the emotional response in the throne room. Describe your internal state at the moment of the Queen's dominance display," I said. "Which part specifically? The moment of the vocalization, the roar?" I thought about it honestly. "Recognition," I said. Vreth Karen's sensory organs tilted forward. "Explain." The shape of it was familiar, the certainty coming from the other side, the feeling that the room had already decided. I had felt that before in the mediation room. You compared a life-threatening confrontation to a civil legal proceeding, she said, not a question. She was reading from a report, I assumed. The report compiled from the throne room. Observation: the room recorded your elevated cortisol signature, but noted that your motor control remained steady, and your vocal tone did not display standard fear markers. I was afraid. I said, "I want to be clear about that." I was afraid, but you smiled, yes. Why? I leaned back and thought about how to explain something that I had not fully explained to myself. "There is a specific feeling," I said, "that you develop when you have been through something you thought was going to end you, and it did not end you, but you came out of it different. Not better, not worse, different, like the thing recalibrated something inside you. After that, when something frightening happens, part of you measures it against the previous thing, and if it comes up smaller, something in you relaxes, not completely but enough." The 9 scholars wrote things down, all 9 at once, the scratching of their recording implements on their devices was the only sound in the room. For about 30 seconds, Veth Quran said, "The previous thing was your pair bond. Dissolution, the divorce." "Yes, describe the dissolution process in detail." I described it. I described all of it. I described the morning Claire told me she had filed the paperwork, the way the light had been in the kitchen that day. Yellow and ordinary, the kind of light that has no business being present when your life is changing. I described the first attorney meeting, which felt like being told the rules of a game you did not know you were playing and had already been losing for months. I described the mediation sessions, 3 of them, each one longer and more expensive than the last, in a building that smelled of recycled air and carpet. Cleaner and finality. I described Gerald. At length, the scholars took extensive notes on Gerald. I described the judge. I described the settlement terms. I described the drive home, the pasta, the forgettable screen program, the sleep. That came because my body demanded it. Regardless of what my mind was doing, I described the morning after. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then the youngest scholar, a narrow-framed Vreth, whose exoskeleton was still pale at the edges, said, "You chose to enter this arrangement voluntarily, knowing that dissolution was a possible outcome." "Everyone does," I said. "You don't go in thinking it will dissolve, you go in thinking it won't, and after it dissolved, you entered no further bonds." "Not yet," I said. "Would you?" I thought about that. "Probably," I said. "Eventually, when it doesn't feel like a very bad idea." The scholars looked at each other. I had learned to read very little of Vreth expression, but I recognized clearly that the look passing between them was something like collective unease. Vreth Karen said, "Humans voluntarily enter arrangements that carry a documented risk of significant personal and financial damage with full knowledge of that. risk, and when the damage occurs they recover and then consider entering the same arrangement again. That's roughly accurate, I said. Why, I thought about the 2 mugs I had taken from the apartment. They were still in the cabinet on the callow bird. I used them every morning. Both of them, because one was never enough coffee when you lived alone in the outer lanes, because the arrangement also carries the possibility of something very good, I said. And humans tend to weigh the possibility of good things heavily, maybe too heavily, but that's how we're made. Vreth. Karen set down her recording device. She looked at me for a long time, then she said something in Vreth that Dell, sitting against the far wall, translated for me. In a quiet voice, she had not intended it for me, I think. It was directed to the room. What she said was, no wonder they frighten the strategic modelers. I looked at Dell. He gave me the small, apologetic head tilt that I had come to understand meant he was about to explain something I would find either illuminating or uncomfortable. The Vreth have been conducting strategic assessments of human-occupied space for some time, he said carefully. The assessments have consistently rated humans as low risk on account of biological fragility, short lifespan, and emotional volatility. Emotional volatility, I repeated. The assessors believe that humans' capacity for strong emotional response would make them unstable under extended pressure, that grief, loss, and personal suffering would be reliable points of collapse. I looked at the table. I looked at my own hands. That is not wrong exactly, I said. Humans do collapse. We fall apart all the time, individually, regularly. Some people don't get up, but said Dell, but the ones who do, I said, get up with the full memory of what falling felt like, and that memory does something. It doesn't make us fearless. It makes us accurate. We know the floor. We've been there. So when someone is trying to threaten us with the floor, we're not imagining it. We already know the exact dimensions of it, and we know we have survived it at least once. The scholars were all writing again. That afternoon, Dell came to find me in my quarters with a message. The Queen wanted to see me, not the throne room. Her private study, which was a room adjacent to her command quarters, and which she used, Dell said, for conversations she did not want formally recorded. The study was smaller than I expected. There were charts on the walls, star maps in battle projections. There were shelves of physical documents in Vreth script. There was a low table and 2 seats, one enormous and one significantly less so. The Queen was already seated when I arrived. She looked different in here. Still the same physical presence, still 8 FT of armor and controlled power, but without the court, without the guards, without the throne platform elevating her above the room. She was simply a person sitting at a table, a person who had things on her mind. She gestured to the other seat. She said, "Your cargo has been examined by my technicians. They confirmed that the seal was hidden in a secondary compartment of one of the drive component casings. It was not on any manifest and was not accessible without cutting the casing open." I said, "So it was planted?" "Yes." "By whom?" She was quiet for a moment. "That is currently being investigated." I nodded. I had suspected something like this since the holding room, but knowing it was true and knowing that she knew it was true were different things. She had the same facts I had guessed at, and she was sitting across from me telling me directly rather than through a court Pronouncement, that was a choice. I said, why are you telling me this? She looked at her hands, which were large and clawed and resting flat on the table, in a way that was almost careful. Because, she said, you are currently the only being on this ship who has no reason to lie to me about it. I thought. About that, you think the people who planted the seal are close to you? I think they are very close to me, she said. I think this was designed to begin a war, and I think it was designed by people who believed that war would end in a way that benefited them. She paused. They believe humans are easy to defeat. I looked at the star maps on the walls, and you're not sure anymore, she said. I was not sure before, but the assessments have been consistent and I trusted them, and I should not have trusted them so completely. Her markings shifted color, moving through a slow amber towards something darker. You stood in my throne room and you smiled at me. No being has done that in 20 years. The last one was a halcyon general. He smiled because he was certain his reinforcements were coming. They were not. I smiled for a different reason. I said, I know, she said. That is what I cannot model. She looked at me, then directly, with an expression that I could not read in breath terms, but that I recognized from human faces on difficult days. It was the look of someone asking a question that cost something to ask. Does it stop? She said. The pain of a significant loss. Not military loss, personal. Does it stop hurting eventually? I looked at her for a moment. Outside the study's narrow viewport, space moved past. Slowly, it changes. I said, it doesn't disappear, but it changes into something smaller, something you can carry without noticing the weight as much, and then one day you realize you've carried it so long that it's just part of how you walk. She was quiet. Her markings were very dark and very still. I did not ask her what she had lost. It was not my place, and she had not offered it, but I understood with the particular clarity of a person who has had their own version of it that she was not asking an academic question. She was asking it the way that people ask things when they have been carrying a weight for a long time and are not sure anymore whether that is just how it is now or whether something eventually gets easier. I said, it gets easier slowly, but it does. She nodded once, which for Vreth was a borrowed gesture from compact trade interactions, not a native movement. She had learned it deliberately, which meant it was deliberate. Now she said, I am not lifting the death sentence yet. There is a political process, but I am placing you in voluntary stay status. Means you are free to move through the non-restricted areas of the ship. I said, thank you. She said, you are going to tell me more about humans? It was not a question. I said, all right. She said, starting with why you name your ships things like Calibird. I laughed. It was a real laugh. Involuntary, the kind that comes from genuine surprise. Her markings flickered briefly into that deep blue-green I had first seen after the throne room, the color that Dell later told me when I asked was the Vreth equivalent of being caught off guard by something unexpectedly pleasant. I spent the rest of that evening telling the most powerful being in 6 star systems about how I had bought a ship with a stupid name and never changed it because the paperwork felt like too much, and she listened with a full attention of someone who had been studying the wrong things for a very long time and had finally found the right question. And somewhere beneath the floor of that warship, deep in a secondary compartment, of a drive component casing, the people who had planted an Imperial seal to start a war were waiting for the outcome they had planned for. They did not know yet how badly they had miscalculated. The ship moved through deep space with the slow confidence of something that had never once needed to hurry. I had been on the Vreth carrier for 19 days by then, and I had learned the rhythms of it the way you learn any place you are forced to inhabit for a stretch of time. Not fondly, not easily, but thoroughly. I knew which corridors got cold near the cooling vents. I knew that the scholars' meal period was 3 hours after the crew rotation change, and that if I arrived just before it ended, Dell would share whatever was left because he said my appetite was documentably interesting. I knew that the Queen's command period ran for 8 hours, after which she disappeared into her study for 2, and that the guards outside the study during those 2 hours were always the same two, a pair of veterans named Torek and Shin, whose armor was darker than everyone else's from years of use, and who had stopped treating me like an active threat somewhere around day 12 and started treating me like a harmless but inexplicable thing they had to keep track of. I knew the ship's communications architecture because I am a salvage hauler, and salvage haulers learn infrastructure the way other people learn neighborhoods. You know that bones of a place, the data relay nodes, the power conduit junctions, the secondary comm channels that run parallel to the main system for redundancy. I had been mapping it all in my head since day 4, not because I was planning anything, just because it was a habit, the kind you develop when your livelihood depends on understanding how broken things are connected, and that habit does not turn off. On day 19, it turned out to be useful. Dell found me in my quarters at the 3rd hour of the crew night cycle, which was as close to the middle of the night as the ship's schedule produced. He was moving quickly and quietly, which was not how Dell usually moved. He knocked, which was not something he usually did either. I opened the door. He looked at me with his sensory organs angled forward in the way I had come to associate with concentrated anxiety. He said, "Something has happened." He did not say it loudly. He said it the way you say things when you are not sure who else is listening. I stepped back from the door and let him in. He told me in short, careful sentences that a faction within the ship's senior command had made a move. 14 officers, led by General Vorak, who was the second highest military authority on the ship and who had been, Dell said carefully, very interested in the investigation into the planted seal. The faction had secured the primary communication bay, which controlled all transmissions in and out of the carrier. They had locked the Queen's senior loyalists in their quarters using security seals that could only be overridden from the communications bay itself or from the Queen's personal command station, and they were currently moving a team toward the Queen's study. "How many does she have with her?" I said. "Torek and Shin," said Dell. "Her personal guard rotation, and 2 research staff who happen to be working late. That's 4 people against a coup faction that just secured the comms bay." "Yes," said Dell. "Where are the loyalist troops?" "Locked in their quarters on decks 4 through 7. "And the ship's internal comm system?" Dell looked at me carefully. "Running through the comms bay, which Vorak controls." I sat down on the bunk for exactly 3 seconds. I thought about the ship's layout as I had mapped it over 19 days. I thought about redundancy. Systems about the fact that every serious communications architecture has a secondary relay about where the junction nodes for those secondary relays typically sit in a vessel this size and about whether any of that was actionable by one human with no weapons, no rank and no business being on this ship in the first place. Then I stood up. I said, "Do you have access to any maintenance sections?" Dell says, "I have a researcher's access level." Which Cove Labs, research bays, environmental systems, and maintenance corridors? I said, "That's what the compact standard architecture gives research staff." Does this ship run compact standard architecture for its secondary say systems? Dell blinked his primary eyes slowly. The secondary systems are VRETH proprietary, but they were adapted from compact standard about 40 years ago, right? I said, "Come with me." What followed was the longest 2 hours of my life, and I have had some long hours. We moved through the maintenance corridors, which were narrow and low-lit and smelled strongly of that machine oil-organic combination that I had noticed when I first came aboard. The corridors were not built for humans, they were built for maintenance, drones, and in emergencies for VRETH crew who needed to access systems manually. I am 5 FT 11 in, which is about 2 FT shorter than the average VRETH, and the corridors still required me to angle my shoulders on the bends. Dell was behind me, moving with the compressed, careful gait of someone doing something they were not sure was a good idea, but had not yet found a reason to stop doing. The secondary relay junction I was looking for was on Deck 3, between the environmental regulation system and the cooling distribution network. I found it by following the conduit routing I had memorized, and when I opened the maintenance panel, I found exactly what I had expected and hoped for: a relay node that was physically connected to the backup communication channels that bypass the primary comms bay entirely, because that is what backup channels are for. The problem was that the backup system required a command-level authorization code to activate, which I did not have. The secondary problem was that command-level VRETH authorization codes are not technically breakable by a human with no special equipment in under 2 hours. The solution, which I am not proud of in terms of elegance, but which I am proud of in terms of outcome, was that back authorization overrides for physical relay nodes use a different security tier than software-level commands. Physical overrides, because they require someone to be physically at the node, are authorized at the maintenance access level rather than the command level, because the assumption is that someone who has physically reached the node is either authorized crew or is already bypassed several other security layers. To get there, Dell had maintenance access. I talked him through the authorization sequence. He entered his credentials and the backup relay came online with a sound like a held breath being released. I got on the channel and I talked. I did not pretend to be anyone. I identified myself: Marcus Val. Human, voluntary stay status, no rank, no authority. I said that there was a coup in progress. I described what Dell had told me about Vorux's faction. I said that the Queen was in with 4 people and that a team was moving on her position. I gave the deck numbers and the corridor routing as best I could estimate from what Dell had described. Then I said, "I'm transmitting on backup Relay Junction 7 on Deck 3, if any of the Queen's loyalists have emergency access to backup channels now. Would be the time I released the transmit key and waited. For about 40 seconds nothing happened, then the channel crackled and a voice came through that was not translated because it was speaking trade language, and it belonged to a Vreth officer named Commander Reith, who was, she told me in clipped and focused sentences, locked in her quarters on Deck 5 with 6 other loyalist officers and access to exactly one emergency override tool that she had not been relieved of because Vorox's people had not known to look for it. She could use it once. She needed to know where it would do the most good. I told her about the team moving on the Queen's study. I told her the approximate timing. I told her that if she could clear a path to that corridor before the team arrived, 4 guards and a Queen, who was by every measure significantly more physically capable than I had initially given credit for, could hold a door against a small team long enough for other loyalists to break free. Reith said, "You are a human freight hauler." I said, "Salvage technically." She said, "Why are you doing this?" I thought about it. I thought about the 2 hours I had just spent in maintenance corridors. I thought about Dell behind me, anxious and loyal and doing something that was going to cost him professionally if it went wrong. I thought about the Queen, her study, asking whether things stopped hurting eventually. I said she was going to be fair about it, even the death sentence. She was going to be fair. There was a pause. Reith said, "Stand by." What happened in the next 45 minutes I only know in pieces because I was in a maintenance corridor and not in a position to observe any of it directly. What Dell told me afterward, and what I later confirmed from Reith's account in the official record that Dell accessed after the situation was resolved, Reith used her override tool on the Deck 5 security seal. She and her 6 officers moved to the junction corridor outside the Queen's study. Vorex East Tate soldiers arrived at the study door at approximately the same time. What followed was not a prolonged engagement. Reith loyalist officers who have served the Queen for decades and Reith coup soldiers who believed they were walking into an undefended room are 2 very different things, and the encounter reflected that difference. Quickly, I know the part I played in it because Dell described it to me and because Reith told me later, very directly and without any particular warmth, but with what I thought was genuine precision. Without the backup relay transmission, she and her officers would have had no communication, no coordination, and no way to know where to deploy the override. The timeline would have been different. The outcome might have been different. I sat on the floor of the maintenance corridor and listened to the ship settle around me. Dell sat next to me. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How did you know the backup relay was accessible at the maintenance level?" I said, "I didn't know for certain. I guessed based on how compact standard architecture handles fail-safe access. And if you had been wrong, then I would have wasted 40 minutes and we'd have been in the same situation, but with less time." Dell considered this. "You proceeded with significant uncertainty." "Most things are significant uncertainty," I said. "You just move anyway." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Your kind is very strange, Marcus Val." "I know," I said. "We think the same about ourselves. Sometimes, when we came out of the maintenance corridor, Commander Wraith was waiting in the hallway with two of her officers. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone recalculating something internally. Then she said in trade language, "Formally, the Queen will want to speak with you." I said I figured I was not wrong. The Queen's study looked exactly as it had the last time I was in it. Star maps, battle projections, shelves of documents, the low table with two seats. She was standing when I entered, which was different from last time, and she was standing very still, which I had come to recognize as the wraith equivalent of someone who is working very hard to maintain composure. She looked at me, I looked at her. She said, "You used the backup relay." I said. She said, "You identified yourself. You gave your actual name and status. You did not pretend to be crew." No, why not? A false identity would have been more authoritative. It might have been, I said, but Wraith needed to trust the information. If I had pretended to be someone else and she had later found out I'd fabricated my identity, she might have doubted the tactical details. 2. The truth is more reliable. The Queen looked at me for a long moment. Her markings were the deep blue-green again, not flickering, settled, continuous. She said, "General Vorak and his faction have been secured. The investigation into the planted seal is now proceeding under direct command. Oversight, the primary finding is already clear." She paused. Vorak believed that a war with human space would strengthen his political position within the Imperium. He believed the war would be short and decisive because the assessments told him it would be, and now, I said. She looked at the star maps on the wall, at the human-occupied sectors marked in the blue that Wraith cartographers apparently assigned to species assessed as non-threatening. The assessments are being revised, she said. I nodded. She said, "You helped me tonight without being asked, without any guarantee of personal benefit. The death sentence is still technically, I know." I said, "Why?" I had thought about how to answer this question since Wraith had asked it in the maintenance corridor. I had a better answer now. Because I said, what Vorak wanted was a war based on the idea that humans fall apart when pressed, that we're easy, that loss breaks us in ways it doesn't break other species. I looked at her, and I have spent 3 years being a very specific argument against that idea. If I had stayed in the corridor and done nothing, and then Khufu succeeded, and the war had started, and humanity had responded the way humanity responds to being attacked by something that underestimated it, then a lot of people on both sides paid the cost of that miscalculation. I paused. I don't want to be the evidence that starts a war. I'd rather be the evidence that prevents one. She was quiet, then she said something that I did not expect. She said, "You told me in this room that the pain of significant loss changes, that it becomes something you carry without noticing the weight as much." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to believe that." I said, "It's true." She said, "I lost my sister 23 years ago. She was a fleet commander. The campaign that killed her was one I ordered." She paused. "I have been conquering things ever since. I thought it was strategy. I think now it may have been something else, outside the viewport. Stars passed, the same. Only." I said, "Yeah, that sounds right." She looked at me. Something moved through her markings, a long, slow wave, from amber to blue-green to something nearly white. She said, "The Vreth do not have a word for what you have been doing, surviving, continuing, choosing to enter things again after they have Harmed you, I said. We don't really have a single word for it either. Resilience is close, stubbornness is also close. Mostly we just call it getting on with it. She said the phrase back in trade language slowly, getting on with it. That's it, she said. I want to offer you a formal role, not as a prisoner, not as a subject, as a human representative. Aboard this vessel, an envoy if you are willing. I thought about the Kahlo bird locked in the carrier's docking bay. I thought about the outer lanes. I thought about the long, quiet routes and the derelict cargo and the cold coffee every morning. I thought about the 2 mugs in the cabinet. I said, I'll need to think about it. She nodded once, the borrowed gesture deliberate as always. You have time, I said. Is there any chance of getting better food while I think about it? Her markings flickered once, that deep blue-green, quick and startled and real. She said, I will speak to the provisions officer. And outside the viewport the stars kept moving and the ship kept sailing through them, and whatever came next was already on its way, whether I was ready for it or not. I have found that is usually how it works. 6 months later, I am sitting in the small office they gave me on the 3rd deck of the Vreth carrier, and I am drinking coffee from a mug that Dell procured for me after I explained at some length the importance of having a proper vessel for the morning ritual. The mug is Vreth made, which means it is slightly too large and very well constructed and will probably outlast me by several centuries. It does not match any other mug. I have decided I am fine with that. Outside my office window, which is larger than the one in my old quarters and looks out over the docking bay, I can see the Kahlo bird. She is in the 3rd berth, cleaned and serviced by Vreth maintenance crew who found her original configuration both baffling and philosophically interesting. Her name is still the same. I have still not changed it. Dell suggested I rename her something more impressive given everything. I told him the name was part of the charm. He did not understand what I meant by charm. We talked about it for an hour. He took notes. This is my life now. I am the first human imperial envoy in Vreth history, which is a title that has not existed before and which nobody is entirely sure what to do with, including me. My official duties are technically advisory. My actual function, as far as I can tell, is to be a living, inconvenient argument against every bad assumption the Vreth Imperium has ever made about my species. It turns out there are quite a few of those assumptions. In the month since Vorax's failed coup, the revised strategic assessment of human-occupied space has gone through 4 drafts. I know this because Veth Karen shows me each draft and asks me to read it and tell her what she is still getting wrong. The first draft described humans as unpredictably resilient. The second called us adversarially irrational under loss conditions. The third attempted the phrase loss tolerant to a degree that disrupts standard tactical modeling and got closer. The fourth draft, the current one, has a section that I helped write, and it says, in precise trade language, that human decision-making under pressure cannot be adequately modeled by any system that treats personal suffering as a reliable route to behavioral collapse, because humans have developed across their history a specific and transferable capacity to absorb the worst outcome, recognize it as survivable, and proceed. Veth Karen told me it was the most uncomfortable thing she had ever written professionally. I told her that was a good sign. Vorak and his 13 co-conspirators have been tried by Vreth imperial law and are now doing whatever Vreth do with people who attempt coups, which I have been told is both more severe and more procedurally careful than the human equivalent, and which I have decided not to investigate in detail because I have enough complexity in my life. The political faction that backed Vorak, a group of senior military families who had built their position on the expectation of easy expansion into human space, have been publicly censured and privately furious about it. Some of them are trying to find other routes to the same outcome. The Queen knows this, I know this. We have had several conversations about it in the study over the past months that have been less about grand policy and more about the specific and unglamorous reality of dealing with people who have decided something is owed to them and are unwilling to update that belief regardless of evidence. She is, it turns out, extremely good at navigating that kind of thing, better than I am. I told her so once and she said in her precise translated voice, "You navigate it differently. You do not have the institutional leverage I have. So you use other things." I asked her, "What other things?" She said, "You are honest to a degree that is difficult to counter politically. People who are used to strategic dishonesty do not have a response to someone who simply says the truth and clearly." I thought about that. For a while, I thought about Gerald, about the attorneys, about all those rooms where the truth was technically present but had been arranged to mean something different from what it was. I thought about the morning I had decided, somewhere between the parking structure and the pasta dinner, that I was done arranging things, that I would rather be the person who said the clear truth thing and dealt with whatever that cost. It had cost me a lot some of those times. It had also apparently gotten me here. I got a message from Reese 2 months after the coup. She had been promoted, which she noted without comment and which seemed to please her less than it might have. She sent it to my official envoy channel, which meant it was technically a formal communication, but she wrote it in a way that was more direct than formal. She said, "The backup relay analysis showed that you had approximately 4 minutes before Vorax's team would have reached the study door. You had been in the maintenance corridor for longer than that. Before you found the junction, you did not know if the Queen was still unharmed when you transmitted." I wrote back, "No, I didn't." She wrote, "You transmitted anyway." I wrote, "Yes." She was quiet on the channel for 2 days. Then she wrote, "I am beginning to understand the assessment revision." I thought that was a good place to leave it. The thing about humans that nobody talks about, the thing that I keep running into in these conversations with Vreth scholars and commanders, and sometimes in the study with the Queen herself, is that human resilience is not a strategy. It is not a thing we developed on purpose. It is not a program running in the background of our biology that activates when conditions get difficult. It is what happens when you have been through enough bad Tuesdays that you stop believing the current Tuesday is going to be the last one. It is what happens when you have been to the floor and you know the exact feel of the floor, and you know, not theoretically, but in your actual body, that you got up from it before. It is not hope exactly. It is more than hope, because it is grounded. It is not courage exactly. It is more than courage, because it is not the absence of fear. It is just this, the specific knowledge that you have survived a thing And that survival is a proof of concept. That carries forward, the Vreth do not. Have this because they do not need it. They are biologically durable, they are. Long-lived, they are not built to feel. Lost the way humans feel it. Their strategic weakness, which I have said, carefully and with full documentation too, Veth Quran, and which she has included in the assessment revision, is that they have no emotional callus. Every serious loss hits them as fresh catastrophe. Because they have no framework for surviving it, they are powerful and they are precise, and they have been winning for 200 years, and they have no idea what to do when they don't. Humans know what to do. We have been doing it since before we had the vocabulary for it. We make dinner, we sleep or try to, we get up. That is the whole thing. That is the entire thing that Vorek did not model when he decided a war with human space was a quick and profitable venture. That is the thing his assessors had labeled emotional volatility and filed under strategic weakness. He was looking at the falling and calling it fragility. He never seen us get up on a Thursday morning 4 months into my time as official envoy. I was in the study with the Queen when she asked me something she had been building toward for several weeks. I could tell because she had the particular stillness of someone who has arranged their approach carefully. She said, "Would you tell me about the good years?" I said, "With Claire." She said, "Yes, I thought about it. I thought about the market on Europa and the 2 mugs. I thought about an evening about 4 years before the end when we had been sitting outside on a transit platform on Titan Station, waiting for a delayed shuttle, and it was cold, and the delay was getting longer, and we had shared a single jacket between us and complained about the cold and laughed about something I cannot even remember, and then simply and completely a pair of people who were glad to be in the same place. I said they were good years. She said, "Tell me one." I told her about the Europa market and the mugs and the shuttle platform and the jacket. I told her about the morning 3 years in when Claire had made coffee and brought it to me without being asked, both mugs, and sat next to me on the couch without saying anything, and how that had felt like the most honest thing a person had ever done for me. The Queen listened. Her markings were very still and very pale. She said when I was done, "I did not know it could be like that." I said, "It can." She said, "The loss makes sense to me now in a way it did not before, not the pain precisely, but why the loss is the size it is, because the thing that was lost was that size." I said, "Yes." She was quiet, then she said, "I think I understand now what you meant about carrying it, the loss of my sister. I have been treating it as a wound that could be covered. I think it is instead something that has to be carried, and carrying it is not the same as being destroyed by it." I said, "That's it exactly." She said, "Getting on with it." I said, "That's it." She nodded once, that deliberate borrowed gesture. Then she looked at the star maps, at all the blue-marked sectors that were going to need to be reviewed now, and she said, "There is a session of the Galactic Compact convening in 8 weeks, a formal diplomatic meeting. I am required to send a representative to the human delegation." I said, "You're going to send me?" She said, "You are the envoy." I said, "My ship needs new stabilizers before an 8-week trip." She said, "I have already spoken to the maintenance crew." I looked at her. "You were very confident I'd say yes." Her markings moved through that wave of blue-green You are human, she said. You will say yes because it is the next thing to do, and you do the next thing. She was not wrong. I finished my coffee that morning in the study, looking at the star maps and thinking about the 8 weeks ahead and the human delegation who were going to have a great many questions about why a salvage hauler from Titan Station was representing the Vreth Imperium. I thought about what I would tell them. I thought I would tell them the truth. The way I always did, the clear, simple truth thing. I would tell them that I had found myself in a situation that was supposed to end badly, and it had not. And that the reason it had not was not because I was impressive, but because I was stubborn. And because the worst Tuesday of my life had turned out not to be the last Tuesday, and because sometimes that is all it takes. I would also tell them that the most powerful being in 6 star systems had asked me whether pain stops hurting, and eventually, and had nodded when I told her it changes, and had said very carefully, getting on with it, and had meant it, and that meaning it was the beginning of something, the way mornings are the beginning of something, every single one. I would tell them, we are going to be okay. I have always believed that it is not because things are easy. It is not because loss is small or fear is nothing or Tuesdays are gentle. It is because I have been to the floor, and the floor is survivable, and I know that. Now in my bones, I got up. That is the whole story. That is the thing no alien empire could have predicted, and no strategic assessment could have modeled. We get up every single time. We get up.